Picture this, you spend 5 years of your life hunched over the world's most powerful telescopes, capturing thousands of photographs of the moon's surface. You meticulously catalog every crater, every ridge, every shadow. You create the most detailed map of our celestial neighbor that humanity has ever seen. Then, when the most important mission in human history needs those very maps to land safely on the moon, they barely use them. This is the story of Gerard Kuiper, the Dutch astronomer who hand-mapped the moon in exquisite detail, only to watch NASA chart their own course to the Sea of Tranquility. It's a tale that reveals something profound about how we navigate between careful preparation and bold improvisation, between the methodical and the momentous. The year was 1955, and the space race hadn't even officially begun. Sputnik was still 2 years away from beeping its way into orbit, yet Gerard Kuiper was already thinking ahead. At an International Astronomical Union meeting that year, this soft-spoken astronomer with wire-rimmed glasses stood up and made what seemed like a modest request. He wanted collaborators for a project to create a comprehensive photographic map of the moon. The response? Deafening silence. Only one person in the entire room showed any interest. It was a moment that perfectly captured the state of lunar science in the 1950s. Most astronomers were looking outward to distant stars and galaxies, not inward to our nearest neighbor. The moon, they thought, was old news. But Kuiper saw something different when he looked up at that pale disk hanging in the night sky. Where others saw a dead rock, he saw a Rosetta Stone for understanding planetary formation. Where others saw craters as simple impact marks, he envisioned a complex geological history waiting to be decoded. Most importantly, he sensed that this seemingly barren world might soon become humanity's first stepping stone to the cosmos. The roots of this prescient vision stretched back to a small village in North Holland, where a tailor's son named Gerrit Peter Kuiper, he would later Americanize his name to Gerard, was born on December 7, 1905. The village of Twickenhorn in Harenkarspel was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the rhythm of life followed the seasons and the cycles of the moon. It was an unlikely birthplace for someone who would revolutionize humanity's understanding of the solar system. But young Gerrit possessed something extraordinary that set him apart from his neighbors. Eyesight so sharp it bordered on the supernatural. While most people can see stars down to about magnitude 6 with the naked eye, the limit where individual stars fade into the background glow of the night sky, Kuiper could see stars 4 times fainter, down to magnitude 7.5. To put this in perspective, imagine being able to read fine print that others needed a magnifying glass to see, or distinguishing details in a photograph that appeared as blur to everyone else. This gift manifested early. While other children in Twickenhorn might glance up at the night sky and see a scattered handful of bright points, young Gerrit saw a vast tapestry of light and shadow, patterns within patterns that seemed to shift and dance as he watched. The moon especially fascinated him. He could make out details in the lunar surface that his family and friends insisted weren't there until they borrowed his father's reading glasses and suddenly saw what he had been describing all along. The contrast between his extraordinary vision and his ordinary circumstances created a tension that would drive Kuiper throughout his life. Here was a boy who could see deeper into the cosmos than almost anyone else on Earth, yet he lived in a world where such abilities seemed to have no practical application. His father, a hard-working tailor, couldn't understand why his son spent so many hours staring at the sky when there were more pressing concerns, like learning a trade that could put food on the table. But fortune favors the prepared mind, and by the 1920s, the Netherlands had become an unexpected center of astronomical excellence. The University of Leiden, where the great Christian Huygens had once studied, was home to some of Europe's most innovative astronomers. When Kuiper arrived there in 1924, he found himself in the company of legends Agnar Hertzsprung, who had helped establish the relationship between stellar color and brightness. Willem de Sitter, whose work on cosmology was reshaping our understanding of the universe itself. These men recognized in the young student from North Holland something they rarely encountered: a natural observer with both the physical gifts and the intellectual curiosity to push the boundaries of what could be learned from Earth-based astronomy. Under their guidance, Kuiper learned not just how to look at the sky, but how to see it, how to extract meaning from the subtle play of light and shadow, how to recognize patterns that revealed the underlying physics of distant worlds. His doctoral dissertation on binary stars, those celestial dances where two suns orbit each other in cosmic waltz, demonstrated a meticulous attention to detail that would become his trademark. But even as he mastered the techniques of stellar astronomy, Kuiper found himself drawn to subjects that his peers considered less glamorous: the planets and moons of our own solar system. In 1933, armed with his PhD and a Kellogg Fellowship, Kuiper made the journey that would define the rest of his career. He sailed to America to work at Lick Observatory near San Jose, California. The transition from the flat, windmill-dotted landscapes of Holland to the rugged mountains of California might have overwhelmed a less adaptable person, but Kuiper thrived in his new environment. Here, under some of the steadiest skies in the world, his exceptional eyesight could be paired with the most advanced telescopes of the era. The timing couldn't have been better. American astronomy was entering a golden age, with new observatories being built and existing ones being equipped with larger, more sophisticated instruments. Kuiper moved from Lick to Harvard College Observatory in 1935, then to Yerkes Observatory at the University of Chicago in 1937. The same year, he became a naturalized U.S. citizen. Each move brought him access to better equipment and more supportive colleagues who shared his fascination with planetary science. By the time he made that fateful request for lunar mapping collaborators in 1955, Kuiper had already revolutionized our understanding of the solar system multiple times over. In 1944, he had detected methane in the atmosphere of Saturn's moon Titan, proving that moons could have substantial atmospheres, a discovery that would prove crucial decades later when the Cassini spacecraft revealed Titan to be one of the most complex and potentially habitable worlds in the solar system. 3 years later, in 1947, he correctly predicted that Mars had a carbon dioxide atmosphere, overturning decades of speculation about Martian air. That same year, he theorized that Saturn's rings were made of ice particles, another prediction that would be vindicated by later space missions. And in a burst of discovery that cemented his reputation as the era's premier planetary observer, he found two new moons: Miranda, orbiting Uranus in 1948, and Nereid, orbiting Neptune in 1949. Each of these discoveries required not just keen eyesight, but extraordinary patience. Finding a new moon, for instance, meant taking photograph after photograph of the same region of sky, then comparing them frame by frame to detect the tiny moving speck that betrayed the presence of a previously unknown world. It was detective work of the highest order, requiring both technical skill and an almost mystical ability to recognize significance in seemingly random patterns of light and dark. But of all the worlds that captured Kuiper's attention, none fascinated him more than Earth's own moon. Here was a world close enough to study in exquisite detail, yet far enough away to preserve a pristine record of the early solar system. While Earth's surface had been constantly reshaped by plate tectonics, erosion, and the relentless recycling of geological processes, the moon was a museum of cosmic history, its craters and maria preserving evidence of events that had occurred billions of years ago. More importantly, Kuiper sensed that this ancient world was about to become very relevant indeed. The successful test of the hydrogen bomb in 1952 had demonstrated that humans now possessed energy sources powerful enough to escape Earth's gravitational embrace. The development of intercontinental ballistic missiles showed that the technology for space travel was no longer the realm of science fiction. Political tensions between the United States and Soviet Union suggested that space might become the next frontier of competition between the superpowers. All of this pointed toward an inevitable conclusion. Humans would eventually travel to the moon, and when they did, they would need maps. The lunar mapping project that Kuiper envisioned would be unlike anything attempted before. Previous lunar atlases had been haphazard affairs, collections of the best individual photographs available, with no systematic coverage or consistent scale. What Kuiper proposed was something far more ambitious, a comprehensive survey of the entire lunar surface, with every region photographed under optimal lighting conditions and presented at uniform scale. The technical challenges were staggering. The moon presents a constantly changing face to Earth-based observers, with different regions optimally illuminated at different times during the lunar month. To capture each area under the best possible conditions required precise timing and extraordinary patience. Moreover, the Earth's atmosphere, that protective blanket that makes life possible, was the enemy of clear astronomical observation. Atmospheric turbulence blurred fine details, while variations in air density created the shimmering distortions that astronomers call seeing. But Kuiper had advantages that no previous lunar mapper had possessed. His exceptional eyesight allowed him to recognize fine details that other observers might miss. His deep understanding of lunar geology helped him identify which lighting conditions would reveal the most information about each region. And perhaps most importantly, he had access to a network of the world's finest observatories, each with its own strengths and specialties. In the late 1950s, as Kuiper began marshaling resources for his ambitious project, he was essentially starting from scratch. There was no NASA yet. The agency wouldn't be established until 1958, in response to the shock of Sputnik. There were no computer-controlled telescopes, no digital cameras, no satellite navigation systems. Everything had to be done by hand, by eye, through instruments that required constant manual adjustment and meticulous care. The process began at Yerkes Observatory, where Kuiper had established himself as one of America's premier planetary astronomers. Located on the shores of Lake Geneva in Wisconsin, Yerkes boasted the world's largest refractor telescope, a 40-inch lens that had been the pinnacle of telescope technology when it was built in 1897. By the 1950s, it was no longer the largest telescope in the world, but its exceptional optics made it ideal for planetary observation. Night after night, Kuiper would climb the steps to the observing platform, where the great telescope waited like a mechanical beast pointing toward the sky. The routine was always the same. Arrive before sunset to check the equipment, wait for darkness to deepen and the atmosphere to settle, then begin the delicate dance of observation. Finding the moon through the telescope's narrow field of view was easy enough, but capturing the perfect photograph required split-second timing and absolute steadiness of hand. Each photograph was a gamble against the atmosphere. One moment, the lunar surface might appear sharp and clear, every crater wall distinct, every shadow precisely defined. The next moment, atmospheric turbulence might blur everything into an impressionistic smear. Kuiper learned to recognize the subtle signs of atmospheric stability, the way distant lights twinkled, the steadiness of the telescope's crosshairs, the quality of the air itself. He became almost supernatural in his ability to predict when conditions would be perfect for photography. But Yerkes was just one piece of the puzzle. To create a truly comprehensive lunar atlas, Kuiper needed access to observatories around the world, each contributing its unique advantages to the project. This meant coordinating with astronomers across multiple continents, scheduling observations months in advance, and somehow maintaining consistent standards despite the vastly different equipment and conditions at each site. Mount Wilson Observatory, perched high in the San Gabriel Mountains above Los Angeles, offered some of the largest mirrors in the world. The 100-inch Hooker telescope, which had been used by Edwin Hubble to discover the expansion of the universe, could capture lunar details invisible to smaller instruments. But Mount Wilson had its own challenges. The growing light pollution from Los Angeles was beginning to interfere with observations, and the dry mountain air, while stable, could create its own optical distortions. Lick Observatory, where Kuiper had begun his American career, provided a different perspective from its mountaintop perch above San Jose. The seeing conditions there were among the best in the world, allowing for photographs of exceptional sharpness. But the observatory's location in California meant that it could only observe the moon during certain portions of its orbit, requiring careful coordination with other sites to ensure complete coverage. The most exotic location in Kuiper's network was Pic de Midi de Bigorre, a French observatory situated on a mountain peak in the Pyrenees. At an altitude of nearly 9,500 feet, Pic de Midi offered some of the steadiest atmospheric conditions on Earth. The observatory's isolation, accessible only by cable car or a treacherous mountain road, meant that observations had to be planned with military precision. But the results were worth the effort. Photographs taken at Pic de Midi revealed lunar features with a clarity that seemed almost three-dimensional. McDonald Observatory in Texas brought yet another perspective to the project. Located in the Davis Mountains of West Texas, far from any major cities, McDonald offered dark skies and excellent seeing conditions. More importantly, its southern location allowed it to observe portions of the moon's southern hemisphere that were difficult to see from more northern observatories. If you love uncovering these hidden tales of dedication and discovery, you'll feel right at home here. Stick around for more stories that reveal the human side of humanity's greatest achievements. Coordinating observations across this network required skills that had little to do with astronomy and everything to do with logistics, diplomacy, and sheer persistence. Kuiper had to negotiate with observatory directors, coordinate schedules across multiple time zones, arrange for photographic plates to be shipped between continents, and somehow maintain consistent standards despite the vastly different equipment and procedures at each site. The photographs themselves were works of art as much as science. Each one required hours of preparation and only minutes of actual exposure. The lunar surface is surprisingly bright, about as reflective as charcoal, but capturing fine details required exposures long enough to record subtle variations in brightness and shadow. Too short an exposure and important features would be lost in the darkness. Too long, and the moon's motion across the sky would blur the image into uselessness. Kuiper developed techniques for maximizing the information content of each photograph. He learned to time exposures to the precise phase of the moon that would create the most dramatic shadows for each region. He experimented with different types of photographic emulsion, seeking the perfect balance between sensitivity and grain. He even developed new methods for processing the photographs, using techniques borrowed from portrait photography to bring out subtle details that might otherwise be invisible. The result of all this effort was the Photographic Lunar Atlas, published by the University of Chicago Press in 1960. But calling it a book doesn't do justice to what Kuiper had created. The atlas came in a massive box measuring 18 by 22 by 3 inches and weighing 22 pounds. Inside were 230 individual photographic prints, each one a window into an alien landscape. The scale was breathtaking, 100 inches to the lunar diameter, or about 1,370,000. This meant that features as small as half a mile across were clearly visible in the photographs. To put this in perspective, if you had walked across the lunar surface with Kuiper's atlas in hand, you could have used it to navigate between individual crater rims, to identify specific boulder fields, to plan routes across the alien terrain with the confidence of someone following a detailed street map. But the atlas was more than just a collection of pretty pictures. Kuiper had solved one of the most persistent problems in lunar photography: foreshortening. When you photograph the moon from Earth, features near the edges appear compressed and distorted, like looking at a sphere from an angle. Previous lunar atlases had simply accepted this limitation, but Kuiper developed an ingenious solution. He projected each lunar photograph onto a white hemisphere, then re-photographed it from directly above. The technique effectively removed the distortion, presenting each region of the moon as it would appear to someone floating directly overhead. It was a brilliant piece of photographic engineering that required custom-built equipment and mathematical precision, but the results were extraordinary. For the first time, astronomers could see the moon's entire surface as if they were looking straight down at it. The atlas revealed a lunar landscape of stunning complexity and beauty. There were the great impact basins, Mare Imbrium, Mare Serenitatis, Mare Tranquillitatis, that early astronomers had mistaken for seas. Kuiper's photographs showed these regions not as smooth plains but as complex landscapes sculpted by ancient impacts and volcanic flows. The seas were actually vast lava plains, frozen in time since the moon's violent youth. The crater photographs were perhaps the most spectacular. Kuiper had captured not just the obvious features, the circular rims, the central peaks, the debris fields, but also the subtle details that revealed each crater's unique history. Some showed the terraced walls that formed when the impact shock waves caused the crater walls to collapse in concentric rings. Others revealed the strange, smooth floors that spoke of later volcanic activity that had filled the crater basin with molten rock. One of the most haunting images in the atlas showed the crater Tycho, a relatively young impact crater in the moon's southern hemisphere. Kuiper's photograph captured not just the crater itself, but the vast system of bright rays that extended outward from it like spokes on a cosmic wheel. These rays, visible even to the naked eye as bright streaks across the lunar surface, were deposits of pulverized rock thrown out by the impact, a spray pattern of debris that stretched for hundreds of miles across the lunar surface. Each photograph in the atlas told a story, but only if you knew how to read the lunar language of light and shadow. Kuiper had spent years learning this language, developing an intuitive understanding of how different lighting conditions revealed different aspects of lunar topography. A crater photographed during the lunar morning might appear as a simple circular depression, but photographed during the lunar evening when the sun was low on the horizon, the same crater might reveal complex internal structure, central peaks, wall terraces, even smaller craters within the main impact site. This understanding of lunar lighting would prove crucial as the space race intensified. By the late 1950s, it was becoming clear that both the United States and Soviet Union were serious about reaching the moon. The successful launch of Sputnik in 1957 had shocked the American public and galvanized support for space exploration. The creation of NASA in 1958 marked America's official entry into the space race, and suddenly, lunar exploration was no longer a matter of scientific curiosity. It was a national priority. Kuiper found himself at the center of this transformation. His deep knowledge of lunar topography made him an invaluable consultant for the early unmanned missions that would scout the way for eventual human exploration. The Ranger program, designed to crash robotic probes into the moon while taking close-up photographs, relied heavily on Kuiper's atlases to select scientifically interesting impact sites. The irony was delicious. The same moon that had been considered too mundane for serious scientific study was now the focus of one of the largest technological projects in human history. Kuiper's patient mapping work, begun in obscurity and completed despite widespread indifference, had suddenly become one of the most important scientific resources in the world. But even as NASA embraced Kuiper's expertise, the agency was already planning to supersede his work. The Lunar Orbiter program, initiated in the mid-1960s, would place robotic spacecraft in orbit around the moon, allowing them to photograph the surface from just a few dozen miles away. These orbital photographs would have a resolution that no Earth-based telescope could match, revealing details that were invisible even in Kuiper's magnificent atlas. The first lunar orbiter launched in August 1966, and its initial photographs sent back to Earth were stunning. Features that appeared as mere dots in even the best Earth-based photographs were revealed as complex landscapes of hills, valleys, and boulder fields. The resolution was so good that mission planners could identify individual rocks that might pose hazards to a landing spacecraft. Kuiper watched these developments with mixed feelings. On one hand, he was thrilled to see his predictions about the moon vindicated and his scientific curiosity finally validated by mainstream attention. On the other hand, he couldn't help but feel that his life's work was being rapidly made obsolete by technological progress. By the time Apollo 11 launched in July 1969, NASA had created its own comprehensive maps of the lunar surface, based on thousands of orbital photographs that revealed details invisible from Earth. The agency had also developed computer-based navigation systems that could guide spacecraft to precise landing sites using radio beacons and inertial guidance. Kuiper's handcrafted atlases, while scientifically valuable, were no longer operationally necessary for lunar exploration. What twists surprised you most so far? The fact that the most comprehensive lunar maps of their era barely influenced the actual moon landing, or that one man's decade-long obsession with photographing shadows helped humanity take its first steps on another world. Let me know below. I might explore your favorite angle next. Yet even as his maps were being superseded, Kuiper's influence on the Apollo program remained profound. His geological interpretations of the lunar surface had helped NASA understand what the astronauts would encounter when they stepped onto the moon. His detailed knowledge of lunar topography had informed the selection of landing sites. Most importantly, his years of patient observation had created a baseline of knowledge that allowed mission planners to interpret the flood of new data coming from orbital spacecraft. The Apollo 11 landing site in the Sea of Tranquility, for instance, had been selected partly based on Kuiper's assessment that the region was geologically stable and relatively free of major hazards. His photographs had shown it to be a smooth plain with only scattered small craters, exactly the kind of terrain that would be safe for a first lunar landing attempt. But when Armstrong and Aldrin actually descended toward the surface, they discovered that even Kuiper's detailed maps couldn't capture every hazard. The lunar module's computer was guiding them toward a boulder field that hadn't been visible in any of the pre-mission photographs. With fuel running low, Armstrong had to take manual control and find a safer landing spot by eye. A split-second decision that perfectly illustrated the limits of even the most meticulous preparation. This moment, Armstrong manually piloting the lunar module to a safe landing while mission controllers watched fuel gauges drop toward zero, encapsulated the complex relationship between Kuiper's methodical mapping and the reality of lunar exploration. The maps had gotten them to the right neighborhood, but the final act of landing required human judgment and real-time decision-making that no atlas, however detailed, could provide. After the Apollo mission succeeded, Kuiper might have felt vindicated. His predictions about the moon's surface had been largely correct, and his work had contributed to humanity's greatest achievement. Instead, he seemed to feel a mixture of pride and melancholy. In interviews from the early 1970s, he spoke about how quickly his life's work had been rendered obsolete by technological progress. The space age, which he had helped usher in, had made his own methods seem quaint and antiquated. There was also a deeper sadness in Kuiper's response to the Apollo success. He had hoped that the moon landings would be just the beginning, that they would be followed by detailed geological surveys, permanent lunar bases, and a systematic exploration of the moon's scientific treasures. Instead, after the initial excitement of the first few landings, public support for lunar exploration began to wane. The last Apollo mission launched in 1972, and humans didn't return to the moon for the rest of the 20th century. For Kuiper, this premature end to lunar exploration represented a profound missed opportunity. He had spent years studying the moon from afar, developing theories about its formation and evolution that could only be tested by detailed on-site investigation. The Apollo missions had barely scratched the surface of what could be learned from the moon, yet political and economic pressures had ended the program just as it was beginning to yield serious scientific results. The irony was that during the long hiatus in lunar exploration that followed Apollo, Kuiper's atlases experienced a renaissance. Without new data coming from lunar missions, researchers working on questions about the moon's formation and evolution found themselves turning back to his photographs. The images that had seemed obsolete in 1969 became valuable historical documents, preserving a record of the moon as it appeared before humanity's first visits. Modern lunar scientists still consult Kuiper's atlases, not because they provide better data than current orbital missions, but because they represent a different way of seeing the moon. Kuiper's patient, systematic approach had captured subtle patterns and relationships that might be missed in the flood of high-resolution digital imagery now available. His work represented the culmination of centuries of Earth-based lunar observation, a human perspective on the moon that complemented but couldn't be replaced by robotic exploration. Gerard Kuiper died on December 24, 1973, just 4 years after the Apollo 11 landing. He lived long enough to see his predictions about the moon vindicated and his contributions to space exploration recognized, but not long enough to witness how his methodical approach to planetary mapping would influence the exploration of the entire solar system. The Kuiper Belt, that vast region beyond Neptune where countless icy bodies orbit in the cold darkness, was named in his honor, a fitting tribute to a man who had spent his career studying worlds that seemed impossibly distant. But perhaps his more lasting legacy lies in the approach he pioneered, the patient, systematic accumulation of detailed observations that transforms the alien into the familiar, the impossible into the achievable. Today, as we stand on the verge of returning to the moon with the Artemis program, Kuiper's story resonates in new ways. Modern lunar missions rely on digital mapping technologies that would have seemed like magic in 1960, but they follow the same fundamental principle that guided Kuiper's work: comprehensive, systematic observation that builds understanding one image at a time. The new generation of lunar explorers faces challenges that Kuiper could never have imagined: establishing permanent bases, extracting resources from the lunar surface, using the moon as a stepping stone to Mars and beyond. But they also face the same basic challenge that confronted him: how do you create useful maps of a place you've never been? The tools have changed dramatically. Computer processing, laser altimetry, ground-penetrating radar. But the underlying problem remains the same. You need to understand not just where things are, but how they relate to each other, how they formed, and what they can tell you about the world you're trying to explore. You need to transform raw data into usable knowledge, and knowledge into wisdom. In this sense, every planetary scientist today is following in Kuiper's footsteps, using increasingly sophisticated tools to do what he did with photographic plates and infinite patience: make sense of distant worlds, one observation at a time. The methods have evolved, but the fundamental approach, careful, systematic observation guided by scientific curiosity, remains unchanged. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about Gerard Kuiper's story isn't that his work was superseded by more advanced technology. That's the natural progression of science. It's that his approach, his dedication to comprehensive understanding over flashy discoveries, created something that lasted far beyond its immediate purpose. His atlases didn't just help NASA reach the moon, they helped humanity understand what the moon actually was. There's a lesson here about the relationship between preparation and achievement, between the methodical and the momentous. Apollo 11 succeeded because of both Armstrong's split-second decision-making in the lunar module and Kuiper's decade-long preparation at his telescope. The moment of triumph required both the patient accumulation of knowledge and the courage to venture beyond what that knowledge could guarantee. Looking back now, it seems almost inevitable that Kuiper's hand-drawn maps would give way to orbital photography, just as paper charts have given way to GPS navigation. But inevitable doesn't mean unimportant. Those atlases, created with such painstaking care during the late 1950s and early 1960s, were humanity's first real attempt to understand the moon as a place rather than just a light in the sky. When Armstrong took that first small step onto the lunar surface, He was walking into a landscape that one man in Arizona knew better than any other human being. The maps that guided him there might have been created by spacecraft, but the knowledge that made those maps meaningful came from years of patient observation through telescope lenses, from the accumulated wisdom of someone who had spent more time studying the moon than anyone else in human history. And that's why a quiet astronomer's seemingly obsolete obsession with lunar photography still shapes our understanding of planetary exploration today. Because sometimes the most important contributions aren't the ones that get the headlines, they're the ones that make the headlines possible. The story of Gerard Kuiper and his lunar atlases reveals something profound about the nature of scientific progress itself. We often think of discovery as a series of dramatic breakthroughs, eureka moments when brilliant individuals suddenly see what no one has seen before. But the reality is usually more subtle and more collaborative. Most scientific advances build on foundations laid by others, often people whose names are forgotten by the time the final triumph is achieved. Kuiper understood this better than most. His approach to lunar mapping wasn't driven by the desire for personal glory or dramatic discovery. Instead, it was motivated by a deeper understanding of how knowledge accumulates over time. He recognized that someone someday would need detailed maps of the moon, and he was willing to spend years creating them even though he couldn't know exactly how they would be used. This kind of forward-thinking preparation is rare in any field, but it's especially valuable in science, where the most important applications of basic research often can't be predicted in advance. When Kuiper began his lunar mapping project in the 1950s, he couldn't have known that it would contribute to humanity's first steps on another world. He was simply doing what good scientists do, asking interesting questions and pursuing them wherever they led. The parallels to other great scientific endeavors are striking. When Gregor Mendel was crossbreeding pea plants in his monastery garden, he couldn't have known that his observations would eventually lead to the understanding of DNA and genetic engineering. When Charles Darwin was cataloging finches in the Galapagos, he couldn't have predicted that his work would revolutionize biology and medicine. When Marie Curie was isolating radium in her laboratory, she couldn't have foreseen nuclear power or medical isotopes. In each case, the immediate practical applications were unclear, but the long-term impact was transformative. This is the nature of basic research. You study what interests you. You build knowledge for its own sake, and you trust that someday someone will find a way to use what you've learned. Kuiper's story also illustrates the tension between individual genius and collaborative achievement that characterizes most major scientific endeavors. His exceptional eyesight and patient observation skills were uniquely personal gifts, but his lunar atlases couldn't have been created without the support of observatories around the world, the cooperation of dozens of other astronomers, and the accumulated knowledge of centuries of lunar observation. This collaborative aspect of science is often overlooked in popular accounts of scientific discovery, which tend to focus on individual heroes and dramatic moments. But the reality is that most scientific progress is a collective endeavor, with each generation building on the work of those who came before. Kuiper's atlases were possible because Galileo had first turned a telescope toward the moon, because generations of astronomers had improved telescope design, because photographers had developed the techniques for capturing faint celestial objects. The transition from Kuiper's handcrafted atlases to NASA's computer-generated maps represents more than just technological progress. It represents a fundamental shift in how we explore the unknown. Kuiper's approach was essentially artistic. He used his eye and his intuition to recognize patterns and relationships that revealed the moon's character. NASA's approach was essentially engineering. They used systematic measurement and computer analysis to create precise quantitative maps optimized for specific mission requirements. Both approaches have their strengths and limitations. Kuiper's artistic vision could see the moon as a whole, recognizing geological relationships and historical patterns that might be missed in a purely technical analysis. NASA's engineering approach could measure precise distances and angles, creating maps accurate enough to guide spacecraft to specific landing sites. The ideal exploration strategy combines both approaches: artistic vision to see the big picture, engineering precision to make it practical. This combination of art and engineering continues to characterize planetary exploration today. Modern missions to Mars, Jupiter's moons, and other worlds rely on both the systematic mapping techniques pioneered by Kuiper and the precision engineering developed by NASA. The most successful missions are those that combine comprehensive observation with focused technical objectives, building broad understanding while achieving specific goals. Perhaps most importantly, Kuiper's story reminds us that scientific progress often happens in unexpected ways. His lunar atlases were considered obsolete by the time humans first walked on the moon, yet they continued to be valuable for decades afterward. This suggests that the true value of scientific work often can't be measured immediately. It may take years or decades for its full significance to become clear. This has profound implications for how we think about scientific funding and priorities. If we only support research with immediate practical applications, we risk missing the kind of foundational work that makes future breakthroughs possible. Kuiper's lunar mapping project would have been difficult to justify on purely practical grounds in the 1950s, yet it proved essential for the space program of the 1960s. The lesson is that good science requires both focus and breadth, both targeted research aimed at specific problems and broad exploration of interesting questions whose applications may not be immediately obvious. The most successful scientific institutions are those that support both types of work, recognizing that today's esoteric research may become tomorrow's practical necessity. As we look toward the future of space exploration, Kuiper's story offers both inspiration and guidance. The challenges we face, establishing permanent settlements on other worlds, mining asteroids, searching for life in the outer solar system, will require the same combination of patient observation and bold action that characterized the early space program. We'll need people like Kuiper willing to spend years building comprehensive understanding of distant worlds, and people like Armstrong willing to venture into the unknown with imperfect knowledge. The tools and techniques will continue to evolve, but the fundamental challenge remains the same. How do you prepare for journeys to places you've never been, to solve problems you've never encountered, to achieve goals that seem impossible with current technology? The answer, Kuiper's story suggests, is through the patient accumulation of knowledge, the systematic study of the unknown, and the faith that understanding once gained will eventually find its application. In the end, Gerard Kuiper's greatest contribution wasn't the maps he created. Important as they were, it was the approach he pioneered. The recognition that the most valuable scientific work is often the kind that seems unnecessary until it becomes indispensable. His legacy lives on not just in the Kuiper belt that bears his name, but in every planetary mission that combines comprehensive observation with focused objectives. Every scientific project that builds knowledge for its own sake while preparing for applications that can't yet be imagined. When the next generation of explorers takes their first steps on Mars, or establishes the first permanent base on the Moon, or discovers life in the subsurface oceans of Europa, they'll be following paths mapped by people like Gerard Kuiper, patient observers who spent their lives studying distant worlds, building the knowledge that makes the impossible achievable. And that's why a quiet astronomer's seemingly obsolete obsession with lunar photography still shapes our understanding of planetary exploration today. Because sometimes the most important contributions aren't the ones that get the headlines. They're the ones that make the headlines possible. If you're in the mood for another gentle mystery about the unsung heroes who made the impossible achievable, our next deep dive awaits you. Until then, remember that every giant leap begins with countless small steps, and some of the most important steps are taken by people whose names we've forgotten, working patiently in the darkness, mapping the way forward for the rest of us. Each observatory had its strengths. Mount Wilson's massive mirrors could capture fine surface details. Pictomidi, perched high in the Pyrenees, offered some of the steadiest atmospheric conditions on Earth. McDonald Observatory provided crisp images during those perfect Texas nights when the atmosphere barely stirred. Kuiper's process was painstakingly methodical. He would wait for the optimal lunar phase for each region, when the angle of sunlight created the most dramatic shadows to reveal topographical details. Sometimes this meant returning to the same crater dozens of times, waiting months for the perfect lighting conditions. He understood that shadows were his alphabet for reading the moon's three-dimensional story on two-dimensional film. The resulting photographic lunar atlas, published in 1960, was a masterpiece of both science and art. 288 photographs, each one a window into an alien landscape. The atlas revealed features that had never been properly documented. The delicate terracing inside crater walls, the mysterious dark patches that early observers had mistaken for seas, the chaotic terrain around impact sites that told stories of cosmic violence from billions of years past. But Kuiper wasn't satisfied with just one atlas. As the 1960s progressed and it became clear that America was serious about reaching the moon, he produced 3 more increasingly detailed atlases. Each iteration revealed new secrets. The final atlas, completed in 1967, contained photographs so sharp that you could see boulders the size of houses scattered across the lunar plains. If you love uncovering these hidden tales of dedication and discovery, you'll feel right at home here. Stick around for more stories that reveal the human side of humanity's greatest achievements. By this time, NASA was in full Apollo mode. The agency had committed to President Kennedy's audacious goal of landing Americans on the moon before the decade was out. Suddenly, everyone needed to know what the lunar surface was actually like. Was it solid rock or loose dust? Were the crater walls too steep for a spacecraft to land safely? Could astronauts walk on the surface without sinking into some cosmic quicksand? These were life and death questions, and Gerard Kuiper held many of the answers in his meticulously crafted atlases. NASA recognized this and brought him in as a consultant for the Ranger program, which would crash robotic probes into the moon to capture close-up photographs in their final moments. Kuiper helped select the crash sites, using his atlases to identify the most scientifically valuable targets. The Ranger missions were NASA's first real look at the moon up close, and they validated much of what Kuiper had deduced from his Earth-based observations. The lunar surface was indeed solid enough to support a landing, though covered with a layer of fine dust from eons of micrometeorite bombardment. The crater walls, while steep, weren't impossibly so. Most importantly, the moon appeared navigable, if you knew where you were going. But here's where the story takes an ironic turn. Despite Kuiper's unparalleled knowledge of lunar geography, despite his atlases being the most detailed maps of the moon that existed, NASA's Apollo planners began to chart their own course. They had good reasons. The Apollo missions required precision that exceeded even Kuiper's remarkable work. They needed to know not just where the craters were, but exactly how wide they were, how deep, what the slopes of their walls measured down to the degree. The lunar orbiter missions, launched between 1966 and 1967, began photographing the moon from orbit with unprecedented resolution. These robot spacecraft could capture details that no Earth-based telescope could match, revealing features as small as 3 feet across. Suddenly, NASA had its own maps, created specifically for the Apollo mission's needs. Kuiper watched from the sidelines as his life's work became, in a sense, obsolete. The atlases that had taken him over a decade to create were being superseded by spacecraft that could do in months what had taken him years. It was like watching a master cartographer's hand-drawn maps being replaced by satellite imagery. More accurate, perhaps, but somehow less human. Yet even as NASA developed its own lunar maps, echoes of Kuiper's work remained embedded in the Apollo program. The landing sites that his atlases had helped identify in the Ranger program informed the locations chosen for Apollo. The geological insights he had gleaned from studying lunar shadows helped mission planners understand what the astronauts would encounter on the surface. His detailed knowledge of lunar topography made him one of the few people on Earth who could look at a fuzzy television transmission from the moon and immediately know where the astronauts were. Think about that for a moment. When Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were bouncing across the Sea of Tranquility, one of the few people watching who could instantly recognize their location was an astronomer sitting in Arizona who had never been closer to the moon than his telescope eyepiece. Kuiper had internalized the lunar landscape so completely that he could navigate it from memory. The Apollo 11 landing site itself tells a fascinating story about the tension between Kuiper's methodical approach and NASA's operational requirements. The Sea of Tranquility had been chosen partly because Kuiper's atlases showed it to be relatively smooth and safe. But when the lunar module actually descended toward the surface, Armstrong found himself heading toward a boulder field that wasn't visible in any of the pre-mission maps. With fuel running low, he had to manually pilot the spacecraft to a safer landing spot, using split-second visual judgments that no amount of prior mapping could have anticipated. This moment encapsulates the complex relationship between Kuiper's meticulous preparation and the reality of lunar exploration. His maps had gotten NASA to the right neighborhood, but the final act of landing required human intuition and real-time decision-making that transcended any atlas, no matter how detailed. What twists surprised you most so far? The fact that the most comprehensive lunar maps of their era barely influenced the actual moon landing, or that one man's decade-long obsession with photographing shadows helped humanity take its first steps on another world. Let me know below. I might explore your favorite angle next. After the Apollo mission succeeded, Kuiper might have felt vindicated. His predictions about the moon's surface had been largely correct, and his work had contributed to humanity's greatest achievement. Instead, he seemed to feel a mixture of pride and melancholy. In interviews from the early 1970s, he spoke about how quickly his life's work had been rendered obsolete by technological progress. The space age, which he had helped usher in, had made his own methods seem quaint and antiquated. But here's the thing about obsolescence in science. It's often more apparent than real. While NASA's orbital photographs were indeed more detailed than Kuiper's Earth-based images, they couldn't replicate the insight that came from years of patient observation. Kuiper didn't just know what the moon looked like, he understood how it worked. He could predict how the interplay of light and shadow would reveal new features as the lunar day progressed. He grasped the geological processes that had shaped each crater and mountain range. This deeper understanding proved invaluable in ways that weren't immediately obvious. When later Apollo missions began conducting serious geological surveys of the lunar surface, they repeatedly turned to Kuiper for context. He could explain why a particular crater had such an unusual shape, or what the distribution of boulder fields might tell them about ancient impact events. His atlases might have been superseded as navigation tools, but they remained essential as interpretive guides. Moreover, Kuiper's approach to lunar mapping established methodologies that influenced planetary science for decades. His insistence on systematic, comprehensive coverage, rather than just photographing the most obvious features, became the template for mapping other worlds. When spacecraft began visiting Mars, Venus, and the outer planets, they followed protocols that traced directly back to Kuiper's lunar work. The story becomes even more poignant when you consider what happened to lunar science after Apollo ended. With the moon conquered, public interest waned, and NASA's attention turned to other targets. The detailed geological surveys that Kuiper had hoped would follow the initial landings were canceled. The permanent lunar bases that many had envisioned never materialized. For nearly 4 decades, humans didn't return to the moon at all. During this hiatus, Kuiper's atlases experienced a renaissance. Without new data coming from lunar missions, researchers working on questions about the moon's formation and evolution found themselves turning back to his photographs. The images that had seemed obsolete in 1969 became valuable historical documents, preserving a record of the moon as it appeared before humanity's first visits. The irony is exquisite. The maps that were deemed insufficiently detailed for the Apollo landings proved perfectly suited for the long-term scientific study that followed. Kuiper's patient, systematic approach had created a resource that could support decades of research, while NASA's mission-specific maps served their immediate purpose and then were largely forgotten. Gerard Kuiper died in 1973, just 4 years after the Apollo 11 landing. He lived long enough to see his predictions about the moon vindicated, but not long enough to witness how his methodical approach to planetary mapping would influence the exploration of the entire solar system. The Kuiper Belt, that vast region beyond Neptune where countless icy bodies orbit in the cold darkness, was named in his honor, a fitting tribute to a man who spent his career studying worlds that seemed impossibly distant. Today, as we stand on the verge of returning to the moon with the Artemis program, Kuiper's story resonates in new ways. Modern lunar missions rely on digital mapping technologies that would have seemed like magic in 1960, but they follow the same fundamental principle that guided Kuiper's work: the patient accumulation of detailed observations, building comprehensive understanding one image at a time. The new generation of lunar explorers faces the same basic challenge that confronted Kuiper. How do you create useful maps of a place you've never been? The tools have changed: computer processing, orbital photography, laser altimetry. But the underlying problem remains the same. You need to understand not just where things are, but how they relate to each other, how they formed, and what they can tell you about the world you're trying to explore. In a sense, every planetary scientist today is following in Kuiper's footsteps, using increasingly sophisticated tools to do what he did with photographic plates and infinite patience: transform the alien into the familiar, the distant into the comprehensible, the impossible into the achievable. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about Gerard Kuiper's story isn't that his work was superseded by more advanced technology. That's the natural progression of science. It's that his approach, his dedication to comprehensive understanding over flashy discoveries, created something that lasted far beyond its immediate purpose. His atlases didn't just help NASA reach the moon, they helped humanity understand what the moon actually was. There's a lesson here about the relationship between preparation and achievement, between the methodical and the momentous. Apollo 11 succeeded because of both Armstrong's split-second decision-making in the lunar module and Kuiper's decade-long preparation at his telescope. The moment of triumph required both the patient accumulation of knowledge and the courage to venture beyond what that knowledge could guarantee. Looking back now, it seems almost inevitable that Kuiper's hand-drawn maps would give way to orbital photography, just as paper charts have given way to GPS navigation. But inevitable doesn't mean unimportant. Those atlases, created with such painstaking care during the late 1950s and early 1960s, were humanity's first real attempt to understand the moon as a place rather than just a light in the sky. When Armstrong took that first small step onto the lunar surface, he was walking into a landscape that one man in Arizona knew better than any other human being. The maps that guided him there might have been created by spacecraft, but the knowledge that made those maps meaningful came from years of patient observation through telescope lenses, from the accumulated wisdom of someone who had spent more time studying the moon than anyone else in human history. And that's why a quiet astronomer's seemingly obsolete obsession with lunar photography still shapes our understanding of planetary exploration today. Because sometimes the most important contributions aren't the ones that get the headlines. They're the ones that make the headlines possible. If you're in the mood for another gentle mystery about the unsung heroes who made the impossible achievable, our next deep dive awaits you. Until then, remember that every giant leap begins with countless small steps, and some of the most important steps are taken by people whose names we've forgotten, working patiently in the darkness, mapping the way forward for the rest of us.